Hello and welcome. Today I am thrilled to introduce you to Dr. Heather Paulson. Dr. Paulson is a board certified naturopathic oncologist, which is no small deal. It's not an easy thing for us naturopathic doctors to achieve, so congratulations on that. And she's also the best-selling author, of a book called Cancer Proof, which I highly, highly recommend. She's really becoming the leading expert in the natural approaches to preventing and treating cancer. So thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you and everyone who's tuned in about self-care.
Yeah, well, let's just jump right in. Like, what does self-care mean to you?
It's such a big and small word at the same time, right?
Mm-hmm.
I had one definition of self-care up until about a year ago. And so maybe this sounds like something you can relate to. I thought self-care was like that yoga class that I went to, or the acupuncture session that I had, or maybe healthy groceries. And I would joke with my patients and I'd be like, oh, I do so much self-care. You know, I'm kind of high maintenance. And if you saw my schedule, you would be like, wow, Dr. Paulson really does a lot for herself. And what I found out a year ago is I had some things happen in my life, as we all do, that brought some more awareness to self-care and what it really means. Mm-hmm. And in that situation, what I realized was all of those little things that I was doing, or big things, whether that was a massage or acupuncture, naturopathic medicine, all of those things that I was doing to care for my body were kind of Band-Aids. So I was going from thing to thing, trying to like keep it together. I don't know. I'm sure you can relate. Like,
totally relate.
You're just trying to stitch the pieces together and be like, okay, I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to yell. Right. Like, I'm just going to keep it together for a little bit.
I had kale for breakfast. I'm taking care of myself. I wolfed it down on the way to work, but I had the kale.
Right, exactly. I got the people screaming in the background. I have the employees. It could be kids or whatever. Like, there's just stuff going on around you, and you're trying to shove in this self-care.
Right.
And when things started falling apart, and there was no option for me to keep it together anymore, I just couldn't keep it together. There was like the seams were ripped. They ripped. My seams ripped wide open.
Yeah.
And what I read from Melody Beattie, who is most famous for writing a book she's most famous for writing about codependency. Mm-hmm. And her most famous book is Codependency No More. Yep. But I was reading a book called The New Codependency, which integrates in like social media and things like that. And there was one phrase that stuck out to me so much, that she said that self-care is not a single act. So self-care is not a single act, it's a lifestyle. And as a naturopathic doctor, I get that like drinking a green smoothie is not a single act. It's part of a bigger lifestyle. If you're just going to eat a green smoothie and then go to McDonald's for lunch, that single act of a green smoothie is not going to shift your health. Mm-hmm. Just like that single act of a yoga class, that single act of acupuncture, that single act of taking your supplements does not equate to self-care.
Right.
When your lifestyle isn't about taking care of yourself. Right. And so it made me pause and say, okay, what is self-care and how am I taking care of myself? And why do I need all these Band-Aids to help, air quote, keep it all together? Right. I should be caring for myself every moment of every day and really not needing to keep it together because I am caring for myself and there is no patch jobs going on. And if there's a need for a patch job, that's really a signal for me to call a timeout and reflect on what am I doing? What am I saying? How are my relationships? What am I showing up for? What am I committing to that I shouldn't be, that I don't want to be, just really causing more inner reflection and self-reflection. So that shifted my definition from hashtag self-care Sundays of whatever it is and to take care of myself to hashtag self-care all day, every day. And just really looking at every moment of my life and asking myself if I was a loved one, is this what I would do to their schedule today? If
Oh,
I was a loved one and not me, is this what I would do in the grocery store? Is this what I would do here? Is this what I would commit to? So that really shifted my idea of what self-care is.
awesome. I think that's so important because I think it's kind of like another check the box activity. Well, I did my whatever, my meditation practice, my yoga class, my 5-mile run, my green smoothie, my whatever, check the box, and I can be running around like a crazy person for the rest of the day because I did my act of self-care. We were talking with Charlie Cropley. He gave his lecture yesterday, and he was saying that real medicine is every single act that you do in a day is an act of self-love. And so you're saying a really similar thing, that it just can't be this thing that we engage in and then disengage from.
Mm-hmm. And in some ways, if you are stuck in the muck and you have all these things and you're juggling all these balls, to say self-care is something that you do every moment of every day might seem overwhelming.
Sure.
Because if I had heard that prior to this past year, I'd been like, what are you talking about? I could barely fit in this 30 minutes of this thing. Like you can interview my acupuncturist. He would verify that I used to like come out and take the needles out and be like, I gotta go. I gotta go. Here's your needles back.
No
like,
way.
I got things to do. You know? And he'd be like, what is wrong with you? Like
Training providers is the worst.
Right. He's like, just give me 30 minutes. I need 30 minutes for the energy to cycle. I'm like, nope, I'm good. I'm done.
I'm a really quick cycler.
Yeah, my energy. Don't you feel it? And he's like,
yeah, it's crazy. It's moving really fast.
Right. So like, if you're listening to this and like thinking, I barely have 30 minutes and how could I make self-care a lifestyle? Right. I just want to encourage you that if it's time for a pause. If that's you, I can speak from personal experience. It's time for a pause. And if you don't take the pause, the universe is going to provide a pause for you.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Like sometimes we need that too. We need to have that moment of something that we wouldn't do for ourselves to be done for us. Mm-hmm. But it's actually less overwhelming to be running from self-care thing to self-care thing than it is to make self-care a little tiny act that you practice every single day through self-love. Right. And self-love is not an easy thing to practice. I can tell you that from experience too. Like self-love feels like something just as easy as self-care, right. But it's really deep work and we have to be gentle with ourselves and really take our time in enveloping our own self-worth and our own self-confidence and our love for ourselves the way that we would want other people to love us and that we would want us to love others as well.
Yeah. I mean, I sit with people every day that are like, well, my therapist told me that I just need to talk to myself differently and I'm not supposed to think those things anymore and I'm supposed to love myself more. And I'm like, well, cognitive behavioral therapy is great. And like, this is so much deeper than that. What gets in the way of us taking care of ourselves does require that deep work rather than I'm going to have discipline because I've decided to commit to my health. And so I'm going to muscle through self-love and self-care.
Yeah, that doesn't work. And again, I'm not saying this from a pedestal. This is all based on just inner work and also working with other people and seeing their process. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work like that because one side of the coin is, yes, you can shift your negative emotions, right? And I was really good at that. But there is a point where shifting out of the negative and being like, all right, well, here we go. We're going to do this thing and I'm going to set this positive mindset and do this positive mantra. There is a point where that no longer works because by just going straight to the positive, you are bypassing some of the lessons. You are missing some of the messages. Right. And one of the things that has really struck me with some of the people that I've worked with for my own personal growth is that have really helped me is that they require you to go into the darkness, and sit there for a little bit. Yeah. And really feel it and feel the consequences, or feel the where it's stuck, or really feel the discomfort. And I think that for me, discomfort and examining areas of my life for discomfort is part of what has opened up the capacity to care for myself.
Okay.
Because when I was bypassing the discomfort and just going to the next thing, I needed to be band-aided together, right? That was the only choice, because I wasn't looking at those areas that needed to be shifted so that I was taking care of myself at every moment. I was just bypassing that discomfort.
Right. I mean, when you say it like that, it's like, well, no wonder nobody does this. It doesn't sound very fun. Do you think that's what gets in people's way of taking care of themselves?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it is uncomfortable to look ourselves like deep in our eyes and into our own souls in the mirror, because when we do that, it gives us two things, right? On the one hand, we have to acknowledge some things that are working and not working. And sometimes when things are not working and there's a lack of self-care and a lack of self-love, if we shift the things that are leading to those conditions, it might affect other people. It might affect other relationships. I've had a lot of tough conversations to get to a place where there is more self-care and self-love.
Sure.
And so, yeah, there's discomfort. But then on the other side, there's so much more freedom. You can be more of yourself. You can live a more authentic life. And when you love yourself and find that person within you that you're like, yeah, I would be her friend. I would totally hang out with her. She is cool. Then you can be that person when you show up at places. And even just today, I had a patient that I hadn't seen in about a year, since some transformations have taken place in my life. And he was like, you seem so much lighter.
Oh,
Like,
really?
you're just like so much lighter. You were always fun before, and I always enjoyed hanging out with you, but like now it's just so much more lightness. And I was like, that's when we're not in love with ourselves. I think there is this layer of heaviness that we carry around. It's uncomfortable to look at it, but it's more uncomfortable to keep carrying it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the thing, is either we're carrying these things subconsciously or we're carrying them in our conscious awareness, and we can be with that. But if we're carrying them subconsciously, they're kind of driving our emotions and our choices, and honestly, our physiological health too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, from cortisol to hormones to everything in between, our neurotransmitters and how we experience happiness, bliss, peace, all of that gets impacted by this self-care, self-love aspect of our health. And so we can do all of the things, right? We can take all of the cortisol manager in the world, or all of the right herbs, and eat the right diet. As someone who knows these things, went to medical school for these things, right? Tells my patients about things, I can say that the moment that I was like, nope, I am doing this for myself. I'm doing this out of love. I'm going to get down to the bottom of some of the things that are blocking my care for myself, and look at some of these things like avoidance and codependency and all of these things that that are there to teach us. When that happened, like weight that I had been working out and trying to lose for however many years, like 15 years probably.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure those listening, you can relate to this too. Like all of a sudden, boom, gone. And it like in 30 days. Wow. So there is a physiological component to this. If you have struggled with something in your health and you're like, why isn't this thing getting better? There are so many different facets to us as human beings, as physical bodies, as spiritual bodies, that impact our health and how we are able to show up in the world. And my experience has been that the world is a lot more fun, a lot lighter, and a lot more enjoyable and more authentic friendships and relationships when you love yourself and you care for yourself.
Well, and you mentioned something in passing just now that I think is really, really important to name every single day, which is the difference between, hey, I'm going to get down and do this out of love for myself rather than I'm going to do this to fix myself. Or like,
Absolutely.
yeah, there's something wrong with me or something not working in my life, or I need this to be better, different, change, go away. So I'm going to read these books or take these classes or work out this way. Rather than, I love myself and I'm going to work out because it feels good in my body, rather than I have these goals and I've got to do X, Y, and Z. And it just doesn't work. And then we get so frustrated and then we give up. And then we kind of go down the rabbit hole of some of our less healthy choices.
Yeah. So one of the things I started asking myself, and now I don't have to ask it consciously as much, is I've said it a couple of times, what would I do if this was somebody that I loved?
Mm-hmm.
Because I couldn't even think of loving myself to that capacity or doing self-care to that capacity, because it always felt like selfish and like there's so many other people to take care of, right? Like patients and relationships and things like that. And it felt selfish to really have that capacity for self-care.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways I've worked around that feeling of selfishness for taking care of myself is to ask, like, okay, if it weren't me, if it were this other relationship, if it was my mom, my friend, my loved one, like, then what would I do? Would I see them tired on the couch and be like, but you have all this work to do, you should finish your chart notes? Or would I say, hey, you're tired, can I get you a hot cup of tea? Can I bring you some dinner? I would probably do those things. I wouldn't crack the whip on them. I'd just be like, oh, rest. Why aren't you resting? You should be resting.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting way for you to work around some of those mental blocks too of guilt, especially if you have other people that you're responsible for. You have to figure out your workarounds.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm glad that you're mentioning that, because I do think that's true for a lot of us, is like, well, I don't really love myself that much, or I don't know how I would take care of me if I could do whatever I needed to do. But that, like, invoking someone that we care about, it's like, oh, okay, well, if I would bring them dinner, maybe I'll bring myself dinner and allow myself to spend money just on me for takeout rather than cooking because I'm exhausted. Or I would cook a homemade batch of soup and bring it over. I'm like, oh, right, I'd like that. That sounds good too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I'm really curious about your assessments, or kind of your wisdom around the link between self-care and cancer, because obviously you're steeped in that, you're an expert in the field, and I'd love to get your perspective more around how, would you say that cancer is more linked to self-care or lack of self-care, or kind of, is there a special relationship there?
I do believe that there is a special relationship between self-care and cancer, and taking care of yourself is one of the keys for cancer prevention. In fact, in my book, Cancer Proof, there's a chapter that's called Self-Care is Not Optional.
Cool. So, awesome. Yes. Did you all hear that? Self-care is not optional. It is not a luxury. It's not something nice if you have time. It's the basic requirement.
It's a basic requirement. And if you can't commit to self-care, then the rest of what we're going to talk about here is not going to be as effective as it could be. It's not to say it won't work, but it's not going to be as effective. And it's not optional. And actually, I had a couple of editors try to get me to change that chapter or change the verbiage of the chapter, or even take that chapter out. And I was like, no, I know my people. Right. I know who I'm talking to.
Yeah.
And I love them enough to look them in the eye and say, it's not optional. Like, put this book down if you're not going to take self-care seriously. Get a different book. It's not for you. So the reason why I think it's not optional is because what I see in my practice over and over again is that a lot of the people who I work with that have been diagnosed with cancer, they have been in this self-depleted mode of caring for others over themselves for decades, not just years, but just their lifetime.
Okay.
And it's often really uncomfortable when all of a sudden you are the glue of the family. You are the glue of your work. You're the glue of everything. And now you're the one that's sick and you need to ask for help, but you've never asked for help before. it's a very uncomfortable place to be in. And so that is something that we work through in my office a lot. Okay, how can you ask for help? How can you ask for help and get the help that you need, instead of just being like, oh, whatever you guys want to offer, I'll take. And then you're eating food that doesn't support your diet restrictions, or you're doing things like you're still accommodating other people instead of doing what you really need for your own health.
Right.
And sometimes what you need for self-care is to tell everyone to back off, that you just need some space. You don't need their help, right?
Yeah.
So there's this like balance in that in cancer care. And that's really something that I see a lot of my patients struggle with, along with their caregivers, their loved ones who maybe haven't been in charge of anything in the household for decades and are trying to figure out how to remold their relationship in order to support this person through their illness.
Yeah,
So
sure.
that's a huge part of it. But there's also a part of self-care, self-worth, self-love, self-respect that is tied to DNA mutations, that is tied to stress hormones that link to cancer cell growth on a physiological level. So it's not just about the emotional piece, but it's also about how the cells are responding to the way that you're living your life.
Will you say a little bit more about that? Will you tell us a little bit more about the DNA
Yeah.
and yeah.
Yeah. So when someone's been diagnosed with cancer, they often have a post-traumatic stress response to that diagnosis.
Sure.
And that shifts the way DNA cells replicate. But the other piece that's been shown in cancer is that if you've had a negative experience happen, an emotional experience happen within 18 months, you're more likely to have a cancer diagnosis than if you didn't have a negative experience 18 months ago.
Wow.
And they've linked that to grief responses. Mostly is what the research is on, is around grief, a traumatic event that's happened in your life in the last 18 months. But I think those traumatic events can also be related to more than just grief. It can be any type of emotional event or trauma in your life. So they've tied that to losing loved ones, whether that be through death or abandonment, is what has really been looked at deeper in the research.
Okay.
But I think that if we kind of peeled the curtain back a little bit more, we would see even more connection between our emotional experience and how we handle that emotional experience and then what happens. So I mentioned post-traumatic stress as part of the cancer experience. And people who experience post-traumatic stress from cancer, they have a higher risk of recurrence. They have a higher risk of their cancer coming back.
Okay.
And those who experience post-traumatic growth, which is looking at a traumatic and stressful experience and thinking, okay, what are the benefits of this? What am I learning? What am I growing out of this?
Mm-hmm.
People who experience post-traumatic growth and have more resiliency, emotional resiliency, they are less likely to have recurrence.
Oh, interesting.
So it affects our tumor cells in our body. And it's just really fascinating to me to help with that post-traumatic growth perspective and get out of that post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
And this relates back to self-care, because in order to have post-traumatic growth and resiliency, you have to love yourself. You have to care for yourself. You really have to do some of the things that we've been talking about and reflect on what's going to support your healing.
Okay. So I guess, I mean, you might have spoken to this, but I want to dive a little deeper. So for the folks that had this grief experience before a cancer diagnosis, or even from the cancer diagnosis, you know, we don't necessarily get much choice around how we emotionally respond, especially to a big loss or a big transition. So was there a difference in how people handled it?
Those studies haven't been done,
Okay.
but I would make some assumptions,
yeah.
about like, if we process the grief, does that put us at the same risk level as someone who shoved the grief down and went on with their lives and tried to still manage everybody around them?
Yeah.
Well, I can't say for sure based on research and numbers, but I can say that that there is a correlation there. The other correlation between cancer and I think self-care is adverse childhood events. So ACEs scores or adverse childhood events also increase your risk of cancer amongst a lot of other illnesses, but statistically increases your risk of cancer. And when you've had adverse childhood events, usually your coping mechanism for being part of the world does have to do with either codependency or avoidance in relationships. And that can translate into lack of self-care and lack of self-love and be carried through. So I think that's another piece of this cancer self-care puzzle.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense to me. How that would all be interrelated, and even just how grief is medically handled. I mean, so many people I know start antidepressants after a major loss, and so again, we're being told culturally and medically to not have it, or well, it was okay for you to have it for a week, but now we're 2 months in, like you shouldn't still be this upset. And so we get a lot of messages, especially around grief, to shut it down.
Yeah. And when we shut that down, then how can we love ourselves, right? We talked about how self-love and self-care really is a piece of that is really being willing to sit in the discomfort and acknowledge what's uncomfortable in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I can say from a great loss in my life that it took me 7 years to really come to a resolution where grief wasn't a part of my regular experience.
Okay. Yeah. And how important that is for it to fully express itself. Otherwise it just shows up in our tissues.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. So do you find that when people have been diagnosed with cancer and come into your practice, that making space for some of the grief or grieving process is part of your treatment plan?
Yeah, part of my treatment, really as naturopaths, as a naturopathic oncologist, I'm blessed with the opportunity to sit with people a little bit longer and just hear their story. So part of the process is just being heard and seen. And then part of the process is, okay, I might refer them to counselors that I know are willing to sit in the grief without prescribing medications if the medications are not necessary. Sometimes medications are necessary, and I have myself prescribed patients anti-anxiety meds and antidepressants during their cancer experience, because if we are completely overwhelmed and unable to function, that's going to also impact our ability to process some of these emotions. So taking the medication isn't a free pass to not process the emotions that are coming up. It's just to fade it out a little bit.
Gotcha.
But that is a part of the conversation that unfolds.
Okay. Yeah. I would imagine that's a huge part of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, and another interesting kind of aspect that you bring to treatment planning and options is homeopathy, and specifically miasm and miasmic homeopathy. Will you tell us a little bit about what that means and how you use it?
Yeah. So I first was taught about homeopathy and miasms in naturopathic medical school. And I remember I had always wanted to work with people with cancer since I had entered medical school. My dad had been diagnosed with colon cancer and had died of colon cancer in my early 20s. And that's why I went to naturopathic medical school. So I went in there saying, okay, this is what I'm going to treat and this is what I'm going to focus on. And in that process, whenever somebody would talk about cancer, my ears would perk up a little bit more and I would pay attention because that was where my passion is and was. And when we were talking about miasms and homeopathy, miasms means that there are some key ways that people kind of show up in the world. And if I were to relate it to something, it'd kind of be like, what's your astrological sign? Are you Virgo? Are you Cancer? Are you whatever? Leo, like what's your sign? You can kind of read the miasms and say, oh, I'm a serenum, I'm a tuberculinum, I'm a carcinosin. And all of the miasms are based on different disease tissues. So carcinosin is based on the reaction that people have to cancer tissue, where tuberculinum is homeopathic tuberculosis and the reaction that people have to that. And when we were reading, or when our professor was reading about from his slides about the carcinosin cancer miasm, I felt like he had actually sat on a couch at a family reunion and had just watched us all interact and took notes and then like read it from a slide in front of everybody in class. And I was so embarrassed about my family. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I love them, but I didn't want the whole class to know how crazy we were.
Nobody really wants that to, a bunch of people that you just met to know everything about you.
Yeah, totally. So that's when I was like, oh, that's why I love working with people who've been diagnosed with cancer, because I get them on a deep, deep level.
Yeah.
And I've lived it and been in environments like this. And in fact, in some of my transformations for myself personally, I always feel like that hero's journey where I'm taking things back to my family and being like, okay, so I just read this book and I distribute it to all of the elders in my family. I'm like, okay, read this, you know, trying to shift the family miasm a little bit, because that miasm has the things that really stick out even to this day, has a lot of perfectionism involved. So perfectionism also means like the mirror to that is lack of vulnerability. Okay. So if you have to be perfect all the time, then you can't be vulnerable. If you can't be vulnerable, then you can't look at what's not working or say, or if you can't be vulnerable, you can't look at somebody and say, I'm tired, I'm going to go rest. Nope, you're perfect. You don't get tired. You don't do these things, you keep going. And that's another part of the carcinosin miasm, is that you just keep going and going and going, that you're kind of tireless and push through a lot of adversity. Okay. And another piece of the carcinosin miasm is martyrdom. So that's a keynote, is to be a martyr. So that means that you do everything out of sacrificial love. But if it was pure sacrificial love, you wouldn't be a martyr. You would be a saint, which I don't know about you, but I am not a saint this lifetime. So to be a martyr is sacrificial love with conditions and expecting some things in return. And subconsciously, that's usually where it is. You're not consciously expecting things in return, but there's some subconscious stuff there. So that is some of the nutshell of the carcinosin miasm, and why self-care is not optional in my practice. Because if you are a martyr, you're not taking care of yourself. Sacrificial love means you're putting yourself out on a plate for everybody else to consume. Mm-hmm. And if you're being perfect, you're not taking care of yourself, because you would have to admit some of your faults and some of the ways that you need to soften in order to not be perfect. So that's how it has shown up in my practice, in my family, in my patients, and why I love sitting and talking with people who are going through the cancer experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, sorry, I can't find my phone and it's ringing. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
My phone somehow got connected up to my computer and I can't figure out how to make it stop.
I had that same issue.
Really?
I had to know how to make it stop. It was like in a recent update.
I know. I just feel like it just keeps on reconnecting, because I feel like I've done this a couple of times. So sorry about that in the background.
That's okay.
Well, what I was going to say is that martyrs often have a hard time with receiving and allowing themselves to be taken care of. And I think a lot of us can relate to that, whether or not we identify as a martyr. Nobody wants to identify as a martyr, but we all know who we are. And but I think that it's hard for us to receive, or to receive things as they are. You know, if somebody's like, oh, I'll make you dinner, it's like, would you eat whatever was on your plate? Or would you be like, oh, are those gluten-free noodles? And look, are we going to have a salad or something with that? Or are we just doing spaghetti and meatballs here? And like, oh, I don't eat cheese. And, like, are we, if we're going to receive, are we willing to really have whatever is offered to us? And so I'm curious about that role of receiving.
Yeah, I think, so one of my teachers, Master Stephen Coe, this is something that really hit home with me the first time I took a pranic healing class with him. And one of the things he talks about is inhaling and exhaling. And from an energy perspective, inhaling and exhaling affects our physical health. From a physiological perspective, he says you can't always inhale and you can't always exhale out of your lungs. If you only inhaled oxygen, like eventually you're going to be so full of carbon dioxide that you're going to die or pass out. And if you only exhale, you'll be so depleted of oxygen that you will also pass out or die. Mm-hmm. So there has to be this balance of inhaling and exhaling. And we see that in our lives. Are we inhaling in our lives, or are we exhaling in our lives? Exhaling can look like service. It can look like caring for others. It can look like anything that you're doing throughout your day where you're putting your energy into something for somebody else or a group of people, mm-hmm. which is all well and good. That's very generous, very loving, very kind. It's important to do exhaling kind of work. Inhaling would be doing self-care. I just took 5 days off for myself to do a meditation retreat. So I could inhale and then show back up at my office and exhale to my patients and have them have a better healing experience. Inhaling can look like taking time for yourself, grocery shopping, all the things, the yoga classes, the acupuncture, the things that we're talking about, that can look like inhaling. Inhaling can also look like sitting still for 10 minutes. Yeah. If you can sit still that long. Yeah. So there's different ways that we can inhale, and we just need to make sure that our inhales and our exhales are balanced. If they're unbalanced, then we get congested. We get congested energetically and physiologically.
Yeah, sure.
Or we get depleted.
Yeah.
So it depends on which side of the coin you're on, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And in light of martyrdom, people tend to run more depleted when there's a lack of self-care. Mm-hmm. And you're setting up the conditions for fatigue and depletion. And when we're depleted, our cells can't replicate as well. They're not getting the oxygen that they need. The mitochondria aren't functioning as well on a physiological level. And on an energetic level, we're not inhaling the amount of light that's needed, because we need light sources. We're kind of like plants in some ways, where we need some light for healthy replication. Mm-hmm. And light comes in many ways, in many forms. There's spiritual light and there's physiological light. And if we're not inhaling and always exhaling, we're not allowing our body to be a receiver of light and be a receiver of love, right? There's some things that you were mentioning, like someone tries to prepare a meal for you and you don't receive it. I had someone try to do something for me, and I'm so used to being the giver, the mm-hmm. exhaler, that someone tried to clean my lunch bag for me because I spilled coconut milk, and I refused to let them help me. Wow. And I'm strong. I am this I have been this cancer woman. I'm strong. I'm independent. I take care of myself.
Yep, I got it.
I got all the things. And he's like, let me clean this out for you. You spilled it. You're doing these other things for these other people right now. I can clean your lunch bag where you spilled coconut milk. And I was like, no. And then I was so embarrassed because there was a spoon in there that I hadn't cleaned in a week. And what if they saw this imperfect spoon? And what were they going to think of me? Would they still be my friend if they saw the junk in the corner of the lunch bag? So I was super concerned about being imperfect. And finally I was like, he asked so many times, I'm like, fine, clean the lunch bag. That's great. And when he came back, I know I was so mortified. When he came back, he wrapped all the things and took such good care of my lunch bag. It was so beautiful. And instead of being thank you and receiving, I was like, oh, I'm so embarrassed. I'm so sorry you had to clean my lunch bag, blah, blah, blah. Just totally rejected this act of service. Yeah. And it was 5 minutes later that I was like, oh, by the way, thank you. Oh, thanks. Yeah. This was after a meditation retreat, a 3-day meditating. So I can't even imagine what I'm like when I'm not meditating. My friend Des can tell you. But yeah, I was like, oh, by the way, thank you. That was really nice.
Right.
And yeah. I'm sure we all do this. I mean, if we're talking about self-care, if this is something that is part of your health struggles, there are times where you're so used to exhaling that inhaling or allowing someone else to be of service to you is a barrier. It's a huge barrier to self-care.
Yeah.
Oh, so I felt
what's the solution? Do you how do we
what's the solution? Well, I think awareness is part of the solution. I did pause and was like, ugh, I think I rolled my eyes at myself like I just did. I was like, oh, you're such a jerk. Like, what is wrong with you? And texted that friend and said, thank you. Thank you so much. That was really nice of you. I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And just left it at that.
Yeah.
And that was hard. I was like, just be quiet, Heather. Don't say anything else.
Yeah.
So I think awareness and looking and being aware of, am I inhaling? Am I exhaling? Am I allowing other people to give to me? And not only am I allowing them to give, but am I fully receiving? Because another teacher had mentioned how when how does it feel when you give a gift and somebody doesn't say thank you? Yeah, what's that feeling like? Why do we give gifts to people? Usually it's because we want to do something nice for them. It's not because of the thank you at the end, but we've been thinking about them. We want to do something nice, like we want to give. And if our gift isn't received, if someone is like, oh, I already have one of these, then you're taking something away from the gift giver as the receiver by doing that. And so they were sharing a story of another teacher that was very financially well off, didn't need his students to give gifts to him, but as an act of love and service, his students were always giving gifts to him. And he would just receive it and say, thank you so much. Wow, this is so kind of you, and give them so much gratitude.
Yeah.
And then later he would pass it on to somebody who really needed it, but first he would fully receive the gift. Yeah. And that receiving a gift isn't just for you. So if you're somebody who has a hard time like me, where I'm like, if this was somebody else that I loved, what would I want them to do? If this was somebody else receiving what I'm giving, how would I want them to respond?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so fun when you've gotten a gift and you thought about it and somebody's like, yay, so excited. And it's not nearly as fun if they're like, oh, you really shouldn't have, or this is too much, or I didn't get you something, or, it kind of gets awkward and it's kind of like, oh,
well. Wah, wah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so we need to give these gifts to ourselves too. And we need to be willing to receive. And the thing that came up is like, for me is like, if I rejected someone cleaning out coconut milk from my lunch bag, how many other gifts have been trying to have like the universe or other people who love me? What kind of gifts have they been trying to give that I've been like, no, sorry, mm-hmm. I don't need it. I'm good. Yeah. I'm good.
I got it. Yeah. I know I have a girlfriend and it's her birthday tomorrow and she never asked for anything. And she's kind of putting out these feelers like, oh, my husband's putting this party together, but I have to deal with my own cake. I'm like, do you want me to bake you a cake? She's like, would you? And I said, yeah, I would love to bake you a cake. What kind of cake do you want? And then because she normally would, oh, whatever cake. She was like, I want vanilla cake with chocolate frosting and sparkles and mermaids. I was like, okay,
oh, that's awesome.
You got it. Like, cause now I know exactly how to make her happy. And so I'm even more excited that I have this very specific mission around the cake rather than like, oh, am I going to get the wrong one? I know she doesn't like chocolate, so it's actually so much more fun. And for me, that's really that divine masculine and feminine energy balance of, being the one who gives and does and produces. And then the feminine, which is the one that receives and is open and allows. And I think, regardless of how you identify gender wise, there's a balance of masculine and feminine in all of us. And I think many of us are way over identified with the masculine energy of do, go, 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 create, rather than I'm going to let myself be and I'm going to let myself receive and I'm going to be open and curious around what could come through my door. And I think we're really missing out because we're so focused that we're not receiving everything else that's around us.
100%. And if masculine and feminine doesn't resonate with you, yin and yang is another way that these energies are balanced. And one of the things about yin and yang is that one cannot exist without the other. You can't have light without comparing it to darkness.
Yeah.
You can't, because they're defined based on each other. What I consider a bright day compared to somebody in Seattle considering a bright day are very different experiences, but we're comparing it to a different level of darkness, right? Yeah. And so it goes back to that inhale, exhale masculine, feminine, yin, yang, giving, receiving, self-care, self-love, and self-disconnect. Those would probably be like the yin and yang of that experience.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been super fun and really informative. I'm really excited. And I hope anybody who's watching is sharing this far and wide with their loved ones and community, because this isn't just about people who have been diagnosed with cancer, but the name of her book is Cancer Proof, which is before we get the diagnosis, these are the tools, these are the practices that we start inviting in order to maintain optimal vitality, but not because we're trying to not get diagnosed with cancer, but because we love ourselves and we value ourselves every day. So thanks so much for chatting with us. If you want to hear more from Dr. Heather Paulson, she's got a podcast called The Science and Soul of Healing, and really interesting conversations to be found there too. So thank you so much. Can't wait to talk to you again soon.